Hello, welcome to this episode of Antinatalist MD. Today I'll be talking with someone who has different views on antinatalism than I do. So thank you very much for joining me. Let's go right into it.
Well, I think it would be helpful first if our guests had a little bit of context for our relationship. Suffice to say, we are romantically entangled in a monogamous and lifelong fashion that may or may not include a contract.
All right. So much for keeping personal things out of it, but yes, correct. So, in your view, how would you define antinatalism?
My understanding is that antinatalism is the belief that all sentience is the root of suffering. So if a being has sentience, then they are predisposed, given the nature of the world, to suffer. And so the only way to prevent suffering is to prevent sentience. And in many cases, the best way to prevent sentience is to not create new sentient beings. So my understanding also is that antinatalists are not out to get anyone's autonomy. So it's not like they envision a perfect world order where it's mandated that no one and no sentient animals can procreate, but they themselves choose not to procreate. And I expect that they also would not contribute to the procreation of other sentient beings by virtue of breeding animals, for example.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much, in essence, how I would define it too. I condensed it down, I guess, to basically a philosophy claiming it is unethical to bring sentient life into existence due to the inherent suffering and eventual death imposed on that being, especially considering such an imposition occurs without the being's consent. So the two main points on this in this definition are the suffering inherent, like you said, in existence, sentient existence, and the violation of consent. So why are you an antinatalist or not an antinatalist?
I would categorize myself as being agnostic on the topic of antinatalism. So I am not someone who necessarily believes that, I guess where I differ from antinatalists is that I don't imagine suffering to be the sort of pure and essential evil that it seems that antinatalists perceive it to be. And I recognize that obviously there are really horrible things that happen in the world. But for me, it's not necessarily true that existing as a sentient being is like in a zero-sum game ultimately a loss. And I think a lot of that is probably predisposition. I had a pretty wonderful life. I grew up in a family where I was loved and where I was taught to love others. I tend at sort of baseline, certainly, to be more optimistic than you are. And so I think for me, when I first encountered antinatalism, those predispositions made it seem just like an impossibly sad way of looking at the world. And that to me is just so, I can't do that. Now, does that mean that I am a natalist? No, in the sense that I don't plan to have biological children of my own. I am very comfortable with that. I think antinatalism certainly has broadened my perspective on the ethics that play into procreation. I certainly see procreation as a much heavier responsibility than I think I did before encountering antinatalism. But I will say that, like, the first time I encountered anything even tangential to antinatalism was the idea of voluntary extinction. And I think I pulled it up on, it came up on some website, and I was like, what's that? And then I found this voluntary extinction website, and I read it. And at first I thought it was a joke. And then when I realized it was not a joke, I just remember thinking, like, well, that's the craziest thing I ever heard, and I'll probably never have to engage with anything like this again. Joke's on me.
Huh. Yeah, maybe we should talk about that at some point here. Just as far as your first encounter with antinatalism and how different it was from everything you saw. And like you said, you kind of dismissed it offhand almost initially, like too crazy to even consider. So yeah, that'd be interesting to get into it more here in a second. I have talked about why I am an antinatalist in this video series before, so I guess I'll just boil it down to keeping in mind the definition I mentioned. I consider suffering to be a great harm that is ultimately preventable and unnecessary. So in a nutshell, that's why I'm an antinatalist, because that's really the only way to prevent suffering in an ethical manner, and that is by preventing sentient existence.
I think it is worth noting here that if we were just to like compare notes on the personal lives that we're not talking about, you probably have encountered more suffering than I have, both by virtue of your own just sort of background and upbringing, but also by virtue of your profession. So I think that's a fair bias that you bring that I don't bring because of those differences.
Yeah, that's a good point, because definitely, I mean, just talking about my profession and just what I see there, I see loads and loads of suffering that once I considered antinatalism, it immediately was obvious that sort of suffering was preventable. Not for the beings that are already existing, obviously, but future potential beings. But yes, I have seen a lot of suffering, and I would say that I'm not unique in that sense. I think lots of people have seen lots of suffering, but I guess tended to see that suffering more in a more obvious manner, and eventually I realized that could be preventable. So I think that's a little bit of the difference. Not that I'm special or unique in seeing that suffering, because suffering happens everywhere in everyone's life. Although yes, some people suffer more than others by far. But I'm more open to seeing that suffering and not just dismissing it, and seeing that oh, maybe we can't do something about this. Not just like, oh, it's part of life, end of story. Yeah. So kind of along these lines, what do you think are the societal implications of antinatalism? And by that, I mean just the idea of antinatalism, just as an idea. Like, how does that, do you think, affect society? And yes, it is a minority opinion, obviously, but if it were to spread, how do you think that would affect society?
Well, it would not spread by antinatalists passing these ideals down to their children. I think that's safe to say.
Well, if they're adopted,
that's possible. That's a fair point. Not to their biological children.
Right.
I think it's really hard for me to envision a world where antinatalism really takes off in a meaningful way, because it kind of reminds me, in large part because of the fact that antinatalists don't procreate It reminds me of like the Shakers, which were like a religious movement in early American history, sort of parallel to the Quakers. But the Shakers like didn't believe in sexual copulation, so they died out. And it's very, I think, sort of earlier traditions of antinatalism probably did not take hold to the extent that antinatalism has now, because we didn't have something like the internet, where people who had these beliefs probably didn't have a community of other people that they could share these beliefs with, refine these beliefs. So I think antinatalism is in the minority just by virtue of its major tenets. But I also think that it has a better sort of fighting chance than it did, even just like 30 years ago. I mean, from a societal perspective, there's no way for antinatalism to get a real foothold in our modern, capitalist society. I think it's clear from our accents that we are coming at you from North America. And I think that, antinatalism is extremely bad business, right? Like, children are a major driver, not just of the economy, but also of things like Social Security. Like, all of our systems, like our major societal systems where we are based on the idea that you keep producing more humans. So yeah, I think that antinatalism has the deck stacked against it, but it's in a perhaps slightly less hostile environment than it was, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But I don't envision it like becoming some sort of major movement absent more substantial societal collapse. Like, I think if things get really, really, really bad, there probably will be more people choosing not to have children, but I don't think that'll be because of antinatalist reasons per se. I think that will be because they sort of look at the world into which children would be born and say, I can't inflict this much suffering. But it's not the idea of like, I can't create sentient beings because that per se creates suffering.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say people have undergone tremendous amounts of suffering in other times as well. I would say during the plague, let's say, millions of people died, but did that prevent them from continuing to procreate? No.
Well, they also didn't have contraceptive technology.
Right, that's true. But I don't know if, that in itself, prevented them, or at least made them think, oh, maybe I shouldn't keep doing this because my progeny will keep suffering like I did. So I think I'm even more cynical than that as far as antinatalism spreading because of more suffering or something catastrophic happening.
Yeah, I don't think I said that antinatalism will spread. I think
no. Yeah. They wouldn't procreate because of it. Yeah. I'm skeptical about that because history has shown that that doesn't really happen. Although yes, contraception is way more available now than it was before. So that might be a game changer there, but I feel these ideas are so ingrained in people that it's hard to imagine that without a lot of outside influence and repetition and perhaps going through the argument and normalizing it. I think that's key, normalizing it. Without that, it's hard to imagine that people will arrive to this conclusion on their own as a majority. A lot of people have already without outside influence, but on a global scale, I think it would be hard to do that without a lot of repetition and normalizing of it. I guess as far as other societal implications, putting aside the likely fact that it won't spread anytime soon in a vast fashion, as far as implications go for the philosophy, like you said, I mean, antinatalism goes against almost all of societal's patterns as far as specifically capitalism, because, you know, if you don't create more customers, then capitalism dies. And as long as people are, you know, chasing money as one of their ultimate goals, then yeah, antinatalism will have a hard time, you know, having a foothold in that environment, which is sad, because obviously antinatalism doesn't care about money; it cares about suffering. So, yeah, I mean, the other thing I wanted to bring up is as far as how antinatalists will or are or could be viewed as the movement grows. I think we could see, you know, a couple different potential paths. One could be that, you know, if a major antinatalist event happens, as far as like someone who is famous, for example, announces, okay, I'm an antinatalist, for example, that will probably draw a lot of attention to the philosophy in a quick manner. And it could be...
Are there any famous antinatalists?
There are some people that I would say lean heavily toward antinatalism, but they haven't specifically said they're
that
antinatalists.
label. Yeah.
I would say Ricky Gervais is one of them. A lot of what he says is antinatalist in essence, but he has never used that word in public, as far as I know.
Would you put
to describe himself?
Would you put Bill Maher in that same category?
Bill Maher is he's definitely child free, and yeah. I think he's called himself that.
Well, and he's openly advocated. I guess he hasn't advocated for zero procreation, but he has certainly advocated for reduced procreation with environmental factors in mind.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting if someone would talk to him about that, to see what his position is on that. But yeah, that's kind of the kind of thing that I'm talking about as far as someone making major announcements like that.
Yeah,
that would be interesting. And I suspect that, you know, a lot of people would immediately be against that and say, oh, these radicals are, you know, trying to spread this dangerous idea. And then I'm sure that some people would take that and twist the philosophy into something that it's not, into something dangerous and so forth. And, you know, that could be potentially dangerous for antinatalists or more public. That's kind of a concern there. So far, the philosophy has been pretty underground. Maybe the exception might be Raphael Samuel, the person from India who announced that he would sue
his parents,
for bringing him into existence. But that was kind of a blur, just a blip in you know, media. It's like a novelty. It's like, oh, look at this crazy guy, and then it died out as far as the popular media is concerned.
Sure.
I think, but yeah, it'd be interesting just to see how that develops. And like I was saying, the more we see of it, and the more it's kind of normalized as an option, at least, the more people will get used to it, and hopefully, eventually, it will just become more of a choice that people make. So, whether you agree with antinatalism or not, I wanted to ask how the philosophy itself and just thinking about it has changed your worldview as far as other matters, not specific to procreation, but just in general.
So I think this is probably the part of our conversation where it would be beneficial to our listeners to sort of uncover a little bit more my story with being exposed to antinatalism. So as, you know, we contextualize the beginning of this, you and I are romantically entangled in a lifelong fashion. And I think that's important to note here, because when I knew from, you know, for several years ago, that you were someone who personally did not want to procreate. So it's not like that was a point of tension between us. And I knew in general that, you know, I was sort of the sunshine in this relationship and you were the rain. Like it's, you know, very clear to anyone who interacts with us for more than, you know, 2 minutes that I am generally more optimistic and you are generally more pessimistic. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
From an outside perspective, in broad strokes, yes.
From an inside perspective, do you really think you're more optimistic than I am?
I mean, I would call myself more realistic and slightly cynical.
Sure, that's what a pessimist would say. So those were not points of tension. I think once antinatalism came into the space of our relationship and you started using that word and claiming that label, that was really unsettling for me. Unsettling and upsetting, because for me, it was really hard to face. It was really, really hard at that time for me to view antinatalism in any sort of depersonalized way. And I think it still is. I mean, that's clear from my comments on like your background and your profession, that I don't know that someone who had sort of, you know, had in, you know, antinatalist words like the die cast the way that I did and had them come up the way that they did for me, would be predisposed to antinatalism. So when you first started using that word, I felt like you thought that our life together was sort of not worth being here for. Like I didn't have any concerns that you had suicidal ideation or anything like that, but I just remember this like really deep sense of sadness over the idea that like if you had been given the option, you would have opted out from all of this, which was very hard for me because I view our life together as very wonderful. And I sort of know that you do too. And you have since explained to me many, many times that the question of like, would I personally have chosen not to exist is not really a useful one and is not primarily the one that antinatalism is concerned with. But I think it took maybe a year, maybe over a year, like a year and a half for me to sort of like come to a place where I was more settled around that idea that like you claiming this label was not saying that you didn't want our life or that you know, somehow would have chosen to skip this, even though that is kind of always, I think it's kind of in the background. And I think what's valuable for the antinatalist listeners here to hear from my perspective is that I would not have gotten to the place of relative comfort with antinatalism that I think I have if I were not in this particular relational situation, meaning that I didn't have a choice about like whether I was gonna be okay with antinatalism short of like ending our relationship, which also does not feel like a choice to me. And I mean that in the best way. And so for me, there were certainly times where I was I remember like really, really sad days and periods where like and it was horrible because like there was no one else that I could talk to because I didn't want to out you, and it felt, for me, it felt almost shameful, like the idea that I somehow was not making our life what it should be, such that you had been driven into this perspective. So I think it's important for our listeners to hear that, like, that was how I took it. Like, I took it deeply personally. Because we are in this personal entanglement, and so it's hard for me to understand how I might not have. But I also, like, through the repeated exposure, I have come to understand and appreciate that whatever their reasons for being antinatalists, that antinatalists are coming from a place of compassion and sort of really trying to stop the madness from their perspective. And so that, I think, I have grown to really appreciate about antinatalism. In terms of how it affects my worldview, I kind of touched on this already, that I am a lot more considered when it comes to matters of procreation. It's not something that I think should be taken lightly. I think it has sort of caused me, and this bleeds over a little bit into child-free territory. It has caused me to notice a lot more prevalently the selfishness that can come with choosing to procreate. I think in sort of a lot of narratives about having children or not having children, people who choose to not have children are sort of cast as like the selfish people who want to be kids themselves for the rest of their lives. Like, they want to be able to stay out late and party and set their own schedules and not be like tied down by a crying infant in the middle of the night. And so I think antinatalism has caused me to sort of flip that image on its head and see that a lot of people choose to have children really from kind of a selfish impulse, where it's like, I want to create a thing that looks like me and someone I love, and that I can sort of, remake the world as I experienced it as a child, but do it better this time. Like, I think it really is kind of rooted in this desire to correct or improve upon the things that happened in our own pasts, in this like weird creative way. So yeah, in terms of how it's affected my worldview, I will confess that if I could have stepped off the antinatalism train like 2 years ago, like 100% would have done that. Kind of like when I encountered voluntary extinction, like I just would have like closed the browser and not troubled myself. But that wasn't an option. And so I have grown to appreciate the compassionate impulse that I think is behind it. And it has caused me to be a lot more just critically engaged with questions of procreation more broadly.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine it's very different to encounter antinatalism when you don't have someone very regularly kind of talking about it and pushing your limits, I guess.
Yeah, so that's, I guess what I would want listeners who are antinatalists to know is that, like, if it's, like, this is, for people who don't naturally sort of resonate with this idea, it is extremely off-putting. So, like, if you're not, if you're talking to, like, casual acquaintances or friends and you're not able to convince them and you feel like the problem is you, like, it's honestly, like, probably something way outside your control, because I would not be here where I am not an antinatalist, but I am agnostic on the topic of natalism. And I don't think I would be there unless I had gone through the last couple of years in this relationship.
Right. I think most antinatalists are not so naive that they're gonna, bring this topic up in casual conversation with people that they don't know.
Oh, I know what you guys do at your Aniara parties.
That they don't already know hold some similar opinions. So
probably wise.
It's like that Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey.
Yeah.
That scene from, what's the series?
It's not a show that I've watched. I've only seen those scenes.
I forget, but it's a funny scene as far as like Matthew McConaughey's character is like, no, of course I'm not going to talk about this in public. But yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, I wish we could talk about it in public. Obviously, it's very sad that we have to keep this very important part of how we view our world secret, because it would be potentially very life disrupting, if not even dangerous.
I do think that there's a lot of value in engaging antinatalism in a sort of rigorous way. So I think there is a lot of merit to the idea that it should be included in like your general education, ethics philosophy course that a lot of people have to take in college. I think the closest that I probably got in that class was when we sort of dipped a toe into nihilism. And so I think there is even if a lot of people reject reject antinatalism, which is fine and fair for them to do. I think that there's a lot of merit in at least sort of having the question broached in a concerted manner.
Yeah, and that's part of normalizing it, is introducing it as a idea in the realm of these other philosophical ideas, which I think is starting to happen. I've heard of some philosophy professors starting to introduce that idea in their classes. It's obviously a very small minority, but I feel like that's starting to be more considered as far as introducing that in philosophy courses, at least.
Well, and I think that's, even if antinatalism, there's never like a pure antinatalist world order. I think that's better for both antinatalists and natalists, because if you get exposed to these ideas, at an age where it still can make a difference, I think you'll have more people who really don't actually want to be parents making that informed decision earlier, which is really valuable. And I think it's better for natalists, honestly, to have that exposure as well, just because when something is talked about, it like in, one of those, I guess, settings that feels a little more neutral, it kind of takes some of the bite out of it. So like if I had, sort of engaged antinatalism, I think it wouldn't have felt like this big, earth-shattering, really scary idea when it came up between you and me.
Yeah, I mean, also just putting up a mirror, up to people and saying, "This is water. You live in this natalist society.
Yeah.
Realize that this is what the environment is.
Yeah.
And just doing that may be enough to." People step back and say, oh, maybe there is a choice here.
Yeah.
And I've heard that sentiment in a couple child-free podcasts, as far as like, oh, I didn't realize this was a choice because no one presented it as a choice.
Right.
And to me, that's probably a very good first step, just saying, oh, this is a choice.
Yeah. And I do think that for people who have suffered a great deal, they do seem to find a lot of healing in antinatalism and in that community. And so just because of that, I would want people who have arrived at antinatalism because they have really been through it in their lives to be able to find that. And that's where I think that also has that talking about it more openly has some merit.
Yeah, it's interesting just as far as like people finding usefulness from a personal perspective, just knowing that others think like this, and just saying, oh, well, because I value prevention of suffering so much, I'm doing this. And it almost becomes, the lack of procreation almost becomes an action in itself, even though it's you're not doing something,
right?
It becomes more of a marker of how you conduct yourself, and it legitimizes it if other people are doing it too in a rational, ethical manner.
Yeah. Which is, I do also want to make some space here for people who claim antinatalism and then like an accident happens. Because I think that would be something that, if that were to happen to you, would be extremely distressing. And I think there is a little bit of a problem in the degree to which some antinatalists sort of hold up the fact that they have not procreated as like, you know, like a vegan who hasn't like touched an animal product in like 30 years or whatever. Like there's kind of a little bit too much patting ourselves on the back. And so I do want to say that like sometimes things that we don't expect to happen. And like, you don't need to feel like you're a stain on humanity if something that, yes, maybe you could control, but then other factors weren't in your control happens that you regret.
Yeah, and I mean, that's, in my mind, a horrible, horrible thing to happen to someone. But
you would agree with me that like that doesn't mean they should kill themselves, for example, or like hate themselves for the rest of eternity or for the rest of their sentient life.
Well, yes, ideally, something happening like that ideally should not increase more suffering unnecessarily. I would agree with that.
That's good of you.
I mean, this kind of gets into abortion. There's no way of like tiptoeing around that. As far as like, okay, if something happens like that, then you do have, again, not everywhere in the world, but in some parts of the world, you do have that potential as an option. And I would say, and I have mentioned this before in my episodes, that even though I think abortion is unethical, I do think that it may oftentimes be less unethical than other actions that would lead to more suffering. And whenever someone is in a place where they have to make a choice about abortion, that's always a bad place to be.
I think that's fair.
There's degrees of how bad it can be, but I think there's no going around the fact that it's always bad, because you're, obviously having to make a choice that has no ideal outcomes, no matter what. So
I think both of you and I would agree that like abortion should not be considered a form of birth control.
Well, it's not ideal, obviously. Much better would be, vasectomy or, tubal ligation or many other options that would prevent conception in the first place. But having said that, sometimes it is the less unethical option. And because of that, it might be rational to take that path in order to reduce suffering in the end. So, I mean, it's a difficult topic, but I think, that kind of has to be said in this context.
Maybe you should slap a trigger warning on this.
I mean,
I guess if
all of antinatalism is a trigger.
That's fair.
If you really think about it. So I think we're past that. I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned, which we've talked about before, but just the difference between not existing and stopping existing, or stopping existence of yourself. These are two different things, and we've talked about this ad nauseum, but just kind of want to bring that up again since you briefly mentioned it. And I think that's a point that's very hard for people to comprehend, at least at first, as far as separating those two things as completely different, because once you're in existence, of course, you can't just stop never having existed.
Yes.
That's too late. You already existed at some point. So it doesn't make sense to, like you said, ask the question of, well, you personally, would you have not wanted to exist? So yeah, that takes us back to kind of the stereotypical natalist response to antinatalists of like, well, then you should kill yourself, which obviously is not rational in the sense that, again, stopping yourself from existing is not the same as never having existed, or wanting those who are not yet in existence to not exist. Because you can still do your best to enjoy the current life you have and still, be able to do productive things with that, and not necessarily mean that you will want to end it. Now, that point may come depending on, how bad suffering gets, and if your choices are limited to, very bad versus,
Yeah.
So that point may come, and it may be rational to do that in certain circumstances, but it doesn't mean that automatically, just because you're an antinatalist, that means you should kill yourself. Obviously, that doesn't make much sense. So the other point that you brought up was kind of just your journey, basically, from this is crazy, I'm ignoring it, to this is something I think about. I don't agree with it entirely, but I am more open to it and understand it a bit more. So it's just funny how, it took, like you said, a couple of years to get to that point. And most people who encounter this that are not already antinatalist or leaning in that direction will not have anywhere near that exposure of like back and forth and correcting of the viewpoints and all that. So
I will quibble with the word correcting.
Well, correcting just misunderstandings, not necessarily that everything I say is correct.
Sure.
But I'm saying there are a lot of misunderstandings about the philosophy that people will just immediately jump to, and having someone who is more into it and say, no, that's actually not how antinatalists view that, or that's not the reason for that, is, I think, very important to just understand that better. And also just, I'm assuming you trust me more than other people. So if you heard the same thing from other people, again, maybe you wouldn't take it as seriously, or you wouldn't consider it for as long of a time. But because I'm saying it, you probably, maybe against your own will, will have to consider it for longer. So I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that.
Well, yeah. I recognize that I'm on an I am a guest on an antinatalist YouTube channel, so I understand that sort of the narrative here is probably going to be interpreted a certain way, but it's not like I found myself in a relationship with an antinatalist who then very patiently brought me along and showed me glimpses of the life that I haven't yet fully grasped. I think that it would be fair to say that in early discussions on this, both of us had ungenerous moments. And so it's not like this has been a, I just didn't get it, and slowly but surely you have been helping me to refine my understanding. So for the record, I would like that to be noted. I think I did read Every Cradle is a Grave. I think I skipped over most of the stuff on, what's it called? Suicide, but when you can, I don't know, dignified exit or something. Because you told me that wasn't relevant to the parts, the actual argument on antinatalism.
Right, a lot of that book is dedicated to that.
Yeah. So I read the antinatalist parts of that book. And yeah, if that had been, and so I think it's fair to say that I have engaged the ideas more than the average bear, who just might sort of get the Cliff Notes version and then hand wavingly dismiss it. But if that book had been my primary engagement, yes, I don't think that I would have the perspective on antinatalism coming from a place of compassion that I do at this time.
Yeah. And to your credit, going out of your way and reading that, it's something that you clearly did not agree with. I mean, that takes some getting over a hump as far as, you know, yeah, courage, I would say. Maybe courage is a strong word, but just, yeah, it does take some extra effort to go beyond that, your
Well, and
comfort zone.
I think it's also worth noting here that my willingness to engage with these ideas is rooted, like, it's indistinguishable from my relationship with you. Like, it's not like I engage these ideas and eventually get to a place where I can see them in a generous light because I care deeply about you. Like, it's not coming from a place of, oh, this is interesting, or I feel insecure about my own perspective, so I have to take these ideas on to defend them. Like, this is not a scenario that I envisioned for myself or would have chosen. And so it's rooted in this space of, I have this person whom I really love, who finds a lot of value in holding this perspective. So because of that, I will seek to better understand and engage this perspective.
Yeah, so it wasn't like a detached, academic, intellectualized approach. It was more like there was emotion behind it because, yeah. And a lot of, like, when you look at how people change their opinions, a lot of the times it is like that. It is from emotion of, like, people they know and, caring for that person and not necessarily having a deep interest in the topic, without regard to anything around it. So, yeah, that's a good point. And then the last point that you brought up that I wanted to bring up is this idea that potential parents have of recreating their past in a better way by having children just never made any sense to me, because obviously, A, they can't change their own past, so they can't recreate their own past. That's impossible. And B,
I didn't literally mean recreate.
No, I know. But in their mind, I mean, that's what they're thinking. Like, I'm going to do this better. But it's like, that makes no sense.
I mean, I remember having a creative writing prompt in the 3rd grade that was like, so it's 3rd grade, so you're not writing like, novels or like 30-page papers. It was just like in a notebook. But I remember it saying, how would you raise your children differently than you have been raised? And so I think, like, that's just an example of a way in which natalism was the water we swim in, to use David Foster Wallace's language. And I think it is kind of like rooted in that creative impulse to do things better and differently.
Yeah. So I think getting at this error in thinking coming from potential parents is something that should be also discussed or brought up, in terms of, no, you're not correcting your past by having children. In fact, you're if anything, you're recreating something that you underwent, which is suffering. And that does not change your past in any fashion. Your past is gone. It already happened. So just kind of bringing that up and, again, putting up a mirror, up to people and saying, this is what you're doing. Realize this, instead of doing it blindly. Maybe some minds could be changed that way. But yeah. So.
Well, I don't know. Yeah. I guess where I think about, like, how well has that worked sort of in the vegan space. Like just telling someone, like, don't you see the problem here, is not typically, like, you have to come to people. I mean, like I was, as you were saying that, I was thinking, like, how many people who don't recognize sort of their own impulses for having children would would choose not to have them if they were able to sort of reconcile with their past in meaningful ways before they decided to have children, whether that's through like, you know, like some other form of community or whether that's through therapy. But if there were some way in which they were able to engage with the things that were hard that happened to them when they were young, I do wonder the degree to which like fewer people would choose to have children just because of like, yeah, like that like corrective impulse of like, I'm going to like to actually see their problems and begin to develop some sort of healing and compassion for the selves that they have been and are, as opposed to just kind of, yeah, I don't want to say blindly, but as opposed to just sort of like doing the thing that they think everybody is supposed to do and not recognizing that maybe some of that desire is trying to heal themselves ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, I would use the word careless when it comes to people who reproduce in that with that idea in mind. I mean, I don't think most of those people have malicious intent with, you know, oh, I'm gonna make this new being suffer. I think it's just carelessness. I think it's just they haven't thought about it, and those who have thought about it either don't care or just dismiss it because they haven't thought about it well enough, or they just have so much momentum from society, cultural, you know, from their family or what have you, that they feel like, well, yeah, maybe this is a interesting idea theoretically, but there's so much momentum going for this that no one's gonna dispute that I do this. So no one's gonna push back and say, well, why did you have kids? Why did you cause these people to suffer? Right.
Whereas the reverse might be true. I mean, I get asked as a woman of reproductive age, you know, there's sort of a like, where are the kids? Not in the sense of like, you know, like I think there is a sense of like, when are you going to do this thing that you're obviously going to do unless you're a freak? Whereas the reverse is not true. Like nobody gets asked, you know, no, you're not going to see a mother like with a toddler and an infant and have someone say like, so why did you decide to put yourself through this?
Right. Yeah. Or very few people would do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it would be very rude to do that. I'm not saying people should do that.
Well, I mean, yeah, and you know, as it stands today, most societies that would be considered impolite. But so I guess the other question I had was, how do you feel about those who disagree with you about antinatalism? So in your case, you know, how do you feel about antinatalists in terms of them personally, if there's any feeling in that, and not me specifically,
I have
but
no
just
feelings for you.
but just in general, you know, you see someone on the street and for whatever reason you learn that they're antinatalist. How does that shape your approach to them or how you feel about them, not knowing anything else?
I think my first impulse is one of sadness, which is interesting because I don't disagree with their choices necessarily, and I don't think that, like, in some ways, I think antinatalism has caused me to, like, when I find out someone that I know is pregnant, or someone has a baby, like, it's not necessarily, the gut reaction is no longer one of like unconsidered delight. Like there's more of a heaviness there. And I think that has come through my exposure to antinatalism. So it's interesting that my first reaction to finding out that someone is antinatalist is still one of kind of this like, oh, like I'm sad for you. And I think the reason for that is because for everything that I appreciate about antinatalism, I still do view it as a sad view of all of this that is existing here. And so I think I would imagine that probably they have encountered things in their life that reasonably lead them to believe that that sentient existence is not worth the hassle, and is not worth the suffering. And so I think that for me, yeah, that causes some sadness. I think after that, I probably feel a sense of understanding. And, if I found out that it was someone that we had a chance to get to know better, I think that would be kind of exciting, because it would be really nice if you had someone sort of in real life that you could talk about these things with, that could actually become like a close friend, as opposed to, your engagement, I think by necessity is mostly virtual, in this realm. So I think those are that's how I feel about like knowing nothing else about like the random antinatalist on the street. I think it's also, I'm not sure, like, because I inhabit what I think of as, like I said, agnostic on the topic of natalism. I think that's kind of a third space. Like, I think you're kind of setting up a dichotomy with this question of like, well, you're either antinatalist or you're natalist. And I think my continued exposure to antinatalism has caused me to just be a little bit more critical of natalists as well, which is not to say that like, if one of my close friends like has a baby, like I'm going to the baby shower, I'm going to be really happy for them. I'm going to do whatever I can to support like their parenting journey. But that's not to say, like I said, like I just regard it as much more of like just a heavier responsibility, as opposed to like, bringing home a rescue pet that like is also like joyful and, a cool thing to do, but is not, because you're like there's a very large difference between creating a home for a being that is already existing and generating that new being.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned kind of feeling sorry for an antinatalist, just doing that about them, because I mean, in a way, that's kind of how I also feel about natalists. And obviously the reasons are different. In my case, it would be because many of them might not know that there's an option. So it may be the case that they didn't entirely want to do that, but they didn't feel there was an option otherwise. So they just find themselves in this by momentum from society. And that to me is very sad.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that.
But also just feeling sorry for really everyone in existence, because we are all stuck in this, and none of us consented to it. And even though there are different degrees of suffering, we all will suffer and we all will die. And that, I think, merits some compassion and kind of saying, oh, that's not ideal. I feel sorry for you. Not in a patronizing way, but just saying, oh, well, I'm in the same boat as you, and that's, I feel sorry for all of us, I guess, in a way more like that. But
such a downer.
But then on the flip side, when someone finds out she's pregnant, and it's like, well, I just cannot picture myself being happy about that, whether I would know the person or not.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know that it's almost, maybe this is too cocky, I don't know, but it's almost like knowing too much. And it's like, oh, the fact that you're gonna, create this person means that that person will suffer and die. And how can I be happy about that? Like, how can I rejoice about you creating new suffering when it wasn't necessary? I just can't bring myself to be happy about that. And that doesn't mean I'm going to be rude to that person. But I don't see myself congratulating them. And when that has happened, I just, kind of
cut ties with them entirely.
Well, no. Usually it goes something like, well, that's a change. That's a big change. Just kind of a neutral, like, acknowledging.
That's a baby.
Acknowledging the obvious, I guess, not in a rude way, or I guess outing myself. Because at that point, most likely that person will not change their mind about, their position on natalism. And if they're pregnant, that means they're already conceived, so it's too late for that person to not exist anymore. I guess if they're still embryos, and they don't have a brain and they're not sentient, then maybe it's not too late. But assuming that this person will carry to term, then it is too late. So as far as kind of just being critical of our own positions, what problems do you find in your own viewpoint with regards to antinatalism?
I don't see any problems with my view. No. I think one of the things that I can respect philosophically about antinatalism is it's a pretty watertight perspective. Like, there aren't a lot of, like, and I think this is part of why it's probably so hard for antinatalists who, have sort of like drunk the Kool-Aid and stepped into that space to understand why other people don't also arrive there. Because if your impulse is, wow, life is really hard, it'd be better if we didn't have to do this, and we don't have to do this, and now I have found a word, antinatalism, that gives language to that conclusion. I think it's really hard to understand why other people just can't get behind an argument that is so clear to them. So I think there is like a lot to be respected in the degree to which antinatalism, like, it really does solve all the problems, like, not in a way that feels good to me personally, but it does solve all the problems. And so I do think that is a problem with my own position. And I think there are people who would describe me as sort of cowardly by not taking a position. And I don't particularly care, because for me, everything is contextual. So like, I am in this long-term romantic relationship with this person for whom I care deeply, who has these perspectives. So I can't just dismiss antinatalism out of hand or not think about it. At the same time, it's not a philosophy that resonates with me personally. And so I am in kind of this like, well, I'm not contributing to the problem that antinatalists identify, but I'm also not claiming that identity for myself. And so I think with my own position, it's sort of just by virtue of my own life circumstances, kind of allows me to cop out, and not sort of dirty my hands, but also not have to like take this really what I consider like relatively radical position that other people in society would find quite off-putting. So I think that's one problem that I see with my position. We haven't really, I know that you have talked about Christianity and antinatalism on your channel before, and we haven't delved into that. And I don't think we need to delve into that deeply here. But I do think that in my own faith journey, and I'm someone who does identify as a Christian and has for a very long time, I do think that there are questions here about sort of Christianity's end game that have not been considered fully within that religious context. And I think a lot of Christian culture, because it is connected to, in the ways in which I've experienced it and in the local context in which I've experienced it, because it's so connected to capitalism, it's very most of the churches that I've been in are not very good at making space for people who actively don't want to have children, in terms of like programming and like just social, events and those kinds of things. And so I think, which is interesting because like Jesus is someone who, whether he chose it or not, as far as we know, did not have children. And so I think that's a piece that like my own position sort of allows me to conveniently sidestep some bigger questions that my position does not solve all the problems that antinatalism solves, but I also can't be an antinatalist because I don't like the way in which antinatalism solves those problems.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I did that video on Christian antinatalism is because regardless of my position on the matter, I wanted to at least acknowledge that even if you're religious, this can be something that can at least be followed. I'll try to avoid saying that it makes sense because I don't know what that means really in that context, but in terms of like acknowledging that there's certainly aspects of religion and Christianity in particular that allows for this to be congruent with the religion. And yeah, like you said, like major figures in Christianity have been without children. And I think that merits some looking at and saying, that's interesting. Why was that? And, one can draw many conclusions from that, but I think it's something that I don't think is discussed almost at all in terms of within religions, as far as, acknowledging. I mean, there's a lot in the religion that doesn't get discussed, even though it may be obvious to an outsider, because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable or inconsistent or whatever. But that's certainly one aspect of things there. So, and also just as far as like getting to more people from a practical manner, it's like, well, why exclude religious people from this? They have the potential to create more suffering by procreating. So I think they should also be reached in terms of, trying to frame this within their own already existent way of looking at the world. So as far as problems that I see with my own position on antinatalism, I think you brought an interesting point as far as a parallel with veganism and how, maybe vegans who haven't touched meat in years can feel better or feel that they are better than others because of that. And that, I think that is maybe, I don't know if dangerous is the word, but it's not great because suddenly you put yourself above others in terms of, does it mean you're, of higher intellect? Does it mean you're more moral, holier than thou?
And I should also say we are vegan friendly people, so it's not like we're here like hating on. Like there's a lot. I think there's a lot of parallels with veganism and antinatalism. Like it has a lot of the same strengths, and it has a lot of the same, like, that can also be married to some of the like same drawbacks.
Right. So, the reason why I think it's dangerous is because once you start thinking of yourself as better than others, then it becomes easier to patronize and to belittle and to
and thereby alienate.
Yeah, right. And to ultimately alienate those who disagree with you, which from a practical standpoint is just, you're not going to get more people to engage with your message if that's your approach.
Well, and I think that's been interesting as an outsider, because it seems to me that antinatalism really does have kind of a little bit of a purity issue, in that, like, they want people to not have children, but they want them to not have children for the right reasons. And it's like, if you're an antinatalist, why do you care whether someone believes the same things about sentience and suffering that you do, if they're choosing, like, if they're still choosing not to have children? Like, maybe they're choosing not to have children because of, like, environmental reasons, or, because, like, it doesn't align with their own career aspirations. Like, I don't know that it matters if the ultimate end product is that they don't procreate.
And I take that pragmatic position as well.
Yeah.
And I guess I don't know if most antinatalists care about the reasons why people don't procreate, as long as they don't procreate. Okay. I don't know. I have no idea what that
sort of like the vegan who like doesn't care if you don't eat meat because you're allergic to it. Like, if you're not eating meat, then
yeah, I mean, there has to be some sort of pragmatic, like,
sure.
Oh, well, at the end of the day, if you're not doing this bad thing, then does the reason matter?
Yeah,
not really. But I mean, to antinatalists, it matters. The reasons matter to them personally because it forms the foundation of what we believe, as far as like, oh, this is what reality shows us, and that forms a foundation for our arguments to, try to engage people in it. So it matters in that sense, obviously, and just making sense of it in your own head. Obviously, you have to have some sort of reason for it. The other problem, I think, with antinatalism is this potential to just have a slippery slope. And that's true of pretty much any philosophy, that, if there's no constraints on it. And the particular slippery slope that I'm cautious to avoid, or try to avoid at least, is violating personal autonomy.
Yeah.
And I made a video on autonomy because of it early on, because I think without autonomy, then you quickly slip into authoritarian type thinking, and ultimately, if we want our own choices to be respected, then we have to respect those choices of others, with the caveat that once your choices start violating other people's rights, then that's a problem. So I think it's always important to keep that in mind in terms of, okay, we want to always make clear that, at least in ethical antinatalism, we want to always respect autonomy. And the way we want people to arrive at not procreating is by them realizing by themselves, through their own choice, that this is better than the alternative. So that's kind of one of the problems, potential problems that antinatalism could face. And then since it's kind of useful to have an outside perspective, I want to ask you about messaging and just what, from an outside perspective, what could be more effective for antinatalists to do or to approach non-antinatalists? Like, what have you seen that are immediate turnoffs, or have you seen that are, useful ways to open people up to that view?
I don't actually know how useful I'm going to be here, because absent of your channel and our personal discussions and reading Every Cradle is a Grave, I don't know that I've actually had that much exposure to sort of mainstream or minority mainstream antinatalism, and how it's typically depicted. I guess from what I have seen, it's a hard sell. I'm not going to lie to you. I think I personally do not feel that I don't mean that, this is going to come across kind of ungenerously, and I apologize for that, but I don't really feel like I've met an antinatalist or encountered an antinatalist position that wasn't rooted in the antinatalist's deep personal suffering. And so for me, it's kind of hard to imagine somebody who had like a basically joyful life arriving at this perspective. And so I think if there are stories of people like that who like have had like really wonderful lives and still arrive at a place of, and it would be better not to perpetuate this, that might be helpful to encounter.
You mean because if someone did suffer a lot, you immediately just jump to, oh, well, they hold that anti-natalist position because they suffered, as opposed to the philosophy standing on its own?
Well, I think this is where I really think this is a philosophy that people who, I guess that's another point. I don't think I've encountered anyone who was in kind of like my position and then was swayed. Like, it seems to me as an outsider looking in to be a philosophy that preaches to those wishing to be converted in the sense that, like, if you've had a really rough go and you see, and you're, like sort of predisposed to see the magnitude of suffering that does exist and to feel that very poignantly, then I think antinatalism like is probably going to resonate with you in a way that it doesn't resonate with me. So
like
it's
from
not,
an emotional standpoint rather than just purely rational.
Yeah. And I think that's, if you're someone who has who has suffered greatly and you see this outlet that prevents all future suffering.
I think there's a lot more emotional resonance that goes into whether someone becomes antinatalist or not than most antinatalists are willing to acknowledge.
Yeah. There's no question that emotion guides decisions way more than we would like to think, and that purely rational decisions are really a figment of our imagination.
And I guess that's another point, kind of going back to our discussion on like including antinatalism in like an intro to philosophy course. I think probably it would be helpful if antinatalism was presented more as an intriguing idea than as like well, you should hurry up and agree with me so that you stop the suffering that could stem from your own loins. Like, I think if it were presented as like, well, even if you still choose to have children, like you need to recognize the degree to which it is your responsibility to set those children up to have as reduced a life of suffering as they can.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's still, I guess the way to say it is we need more patience in terms of playing the long game.
Well, and perhaps more of an emphasis on reducing suffering overall. Maybe that's because I think a lot of antinatalists jump to procreation as the best way, or not procreating as the best way to prevent future suffering. And you might have a little bit more cred if you were, as a movement, actively working to prevent suffering in other ways, so that people, like, once you bring out the big gun of advocating for the prevention of procreation, that feels like it's coming from a place of genuine goodwill and not just like holier than thouism or child-freeism that's trying to find a philosophical undergirding for decisions that people already want to make.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine as far as introducing the concept to people and not shell-shocking them. Just saying, look, I think about suffering a lot.
That's a great opening line at a party, actually. How's it going? So I think about suffering a lot,
and yeah, like going through ways that you would reduce suffering, and maybe that will make it more palatable. I would disagree in the sense that you can't dismiss the fact that all of this is created from the initial procreation decision or event.
Yeah.
And I think to ignore that, then you would just become another natalist, and you're not really addressing the ultimate cause of all this. So I do agree that it could make it more palatable for natalists to get introduced to the philosophy that way. But I wouldn't make it so weak that it just becomes like just a side thing, as opposed to emphasizing that, no, this is the cause of all suffering. So I think not losing that strong point is important.
I think there might also be some benefit for antinatalists in regarding, like, really rigorously thinking through what an antinatalist, like, majority would look like. Because I think one of the first, like, when I have said to people, like, oh, this person that I love, and not that I say this very often at all, but like in the very rare instances where I have shared with close friends that you don't believe anyone should be procreating, the sort of like immediate, like knee-jerk reaction that I get is like, well, we've got to repopulate. And so like that sense of like, well, we have to make sure that there are people, because otherwise society will collapse. And so I think there would probably be some merit for antinatalists in thinking through, like, what does their sort of ideal transition look like, as opposed to just like me individually not having children. Like let's say you all are tremendously successful and you convince lots of people to not procreate. What is the end game? Like, am I just going to be, like, am I going to, die miserably in a hospital that has no one working in it because like there were no like up and coming nurses or, like those kinds of things. Right. So I think maybe having some better visions that you can paint for what that transition might look like could be helpful to the movement.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because, I mean, as people, think about this, then, it's just only natural to like go beyond like, okay, what is the ultimate conclusion of this premise? And yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I guess I would say that there's two issues. One is that the alternative to that scenario, meaning ultimate crash of society, collapse of society, I guess, is continuing suffering and just kicking the can down the road, because society and humanity and all sentient beings will eventually die, no matter what, because, heat death of the universe and so forth. So that is a conclusion that will happen no matter what, and that people should think about, even in a natalist framework, because that will happen no matter what. And antinatalism would just bring that about more quickly. So I don't think there's that big of a difference in terms of the ultimate conclusion of all this. In that sense, the difference obviously is that more people or beings will suffer if you don't engage antinatalism. So you could approach it that way, saying, okay, that's a bad thing, but here's a worse thing, which is the status quo.
I see.
So hence, choose the less worse thing.
Yeah.
And B, yeah, I mean, you could come up with trying to, have some scenario of like, well, we can transition, in a controlled fashion and, have a soft landing as much as we can. The fact of the matter is, no matter what, it's not going to be pretty. Like, maybe there is a scenario, but I can't imagine a scenario where this will be pretty, because death in itself is not pretty. That's just the hand we're dealt. So I don't know that there's a way to like completely soften it in an ethical fashion. Of course, there's the famous red button thought experiment, but that violates autonomy, so that's not ideal. So yeah, I don't know that there's an ideal, like, perfect scenario that I can just come up with and have in my back pocket for natalists who bring it up. But I would say, as in many things in life, there's bad and there's worse. So choose the bad rather than the worse. And maybe that's the best we can do. One point you brought up was using your past suffering as a reason for being an antinatalist. And I think that's completely valid.
I think that's valid. I don't think it invalidates it. I just think that it's not, like, I think a lot of antinatalists don't, like, they want to focus on the philosophical watertightness of the position and the logical merits. And so they don't want to bring up the fact that a large part of why they're antinatalist is because they went through some really awful stuff. And I think that actually, like, bringing that awful stuff into the narrative would actually humanize the antinatalist position in really helpful ways for people who don't resonate with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think some antinatalists do that, and bring that up as far as like, oh, look, I've been through this. Why would I want to impose that on other people? So I don't think all antinatalists are, completely detached from their own experiences in that way. Maybe bringing that up might be more of a additional argument, maybe even as far as like support for the argument. But
I will also acknowledge there's a lot of risk. Like, I understand.
Yeah, right. That's what I was going to say.
I am also remembering that that's a reason that people might not want to do that, and that's totally understandable.
Right. That kind of exposure, is risky in terms of like, oh, you went through that? Like, that's a risk people, just like saying you're an antinatalist is a risk. Saying parts of your past that you have gone through is also a risk. yeah, so that's pretty much all the questions I had. I don't know if you had any closing thoughts or a message to the people that you wanted to say before we wrap up.
I think we've covered pretty much everything. I would just say, like, to the antinatalists who are listening, like, I hope that with what I've shared, you feel seen and recognized and appreciated, even if I don't agree with you. And I also hope that you would not drive away the people in your life that you love and who love you just because of this difference in philosophical position, even when it feels very real and important to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me here. This is unusual for me to bring someone else, obviously, to this video channel, but I really appreciate it. And thank you for your...
Oh, one more thing.
Yep.
I will also say that one of the, I think, things that has made our relationship workable within this context is that you are very respectful of my desire to keep your antinatalism mostly under wraps. Because I do think like there are a lot of social consequences that would come with with you being like more openly out as an antinatalist. And so I don't want to minimize the degree to which like this is still in certain ways like a pretty socially dangerous position to hold. And so I appreciate you keeping it. I think on the one hand, it's sad that you have to do that, but I also appreciate that in a lot of ways we're able to have the life that we do because you are willing to do that. So thank you on that front.
Yeah. I mean, it's also self-preservation. So
sure.
I'm not going to pretend that
you are a deeply selfish individual. I do know that.
Aren't we all? Aren't we all? Hence why we're here. Anyway, so thank you very much. And yeah, thank you everyone who's listening, who's still listening. And yeah, see you all later.